Hello. In this screencast, we're going to introduce you to the causes and events that lead up to the French Revolution. The French Revolution is a classic example of revolution in that it starts out with the idea of radical change. And, like a lot of revolutions, it starts with the best of intentions. If you look at this old poster, a lot of what's on here seems pretty positive, particularly to Americans. Unity. Indivisible. Think of that from our Pledge of Allegiance. A republic, a people-based government. Liberty, equality, fraternity, brotherhood. All things that sound pretty good to a lot of us even today. What you need to take a look at, though, on this poster are the three final words, ou la mort. Because what will happen in the French Revolution is that the alternative to the liberty, equality, and fraternity they sought was death. And you're going to see how the best of intentions ends up taking them down a much darker road. And we're going to start at the beginning, on the eve of revolution. The government of France at that time was known as the Ancien Regime, or simply put, the Old Regime. Simply put, it's a system of absolute monarchy. And in this case, the old regime was headed up by the absolute model of an absolute monarch, Louis XIV, the Sun King, of course, because he thought, like the sun, everything revolved around him. And certainly under his watch, France became a major power in Europe and the world. The largest army, over 600,000 troops, and the number 2 navy in all of Europe. France was not only a political and military power, it was also an intellectual power. In our last unit on the Enlightenment, we learned about some of the great scientists and philosophers of the age. A lot of them, such as Denis Diderot, Charles de Montesquieu, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Voltaire, came from France. So once again, strong not just in terms of politics, but strong in terms of thought as well. France was even among the world's leaders in culture. Art, clothing styles, cooking, all were part of French leadership during the old regime and during the Enlightenment. These are positions they still hold in many regards today. Meanwhile, however, the old social system is overlooking some problems that are ultimately going to lead to revolution, specifically economic problems. The economy is going to be a ticking time bomb, the fuse of which is lit by Louis XIV, and his successors, Louis XV and XVI, didn't do much to solve these problems. And as you'll see, when the fuse finally reaches the breaking point, things happen pretty quickly. The old regime was split up into 3 social classes, also referred to as the 3 estates. They had some very clever names for these things. For example, there was the first estate, which was made up of clergy, church officials, priests, bishops, and such. The second estate was made up of the nobility, many of whom were the courtiers that we read about in the opening segment on Louis XIV. Combined, the first and second estates made up 3% of France's population. And they owned or controlled 30% of the land, which was the primary means of wealth during the old regime. However, they paid 0% of the taxes. Contrast them with the third estate. The third estate obviously would include everybody else that wasn't a clergyman or a noble. That means the bourgeoisie, the middle class, merchants, craftsmen, and such. Common workers in the cities, and peasants in the farming countryside. If you do the math, they're 97% of the population, own or control 70% of the land, however, they pay 100% of the taxes that go into the government. Now, on the one hand, you might say, well, they own 70% of the land, and that's a pretty good deal. That's twice as much as the first and second estates. However, you might want to look at it this way. Let's say you had 100 people and you wanted to divide up $1 among those 100 people. This situation is basically like giving 3 people 30 cents and the remaining 97 people have got to share the remaining 70 cents. Doesn't sound so good when you put it in those terms. In addition, the first and second estates also had a number of privileges that the third estate didn't have. Everything from what style of clothing and buttons they could wear in the clothing to the ability to hunt on royal hunting grounds and take benefit of the game there. This cartoon was a very popular image of that time period, the 1780s and the 1790s. And in it, you can see that the first estate, the clergy in purple, and the second estate, the noble in his red and blue, are basically being carried by the third estate. And this is a situation that the third estate's not going to be able to bear up for much longer. Think of them as the base of that pyramid. And at some point, you might get tired of holding up those people. Economic problems, as we said, began with Louis XIV and will continue under Louis XV, who was XIV's grandson, and XVI, who was XV's grandson. They had a habit of outliving their children in those days, certainly among the Bourbon dynasty, which is the name for the Louis family here. You might remember this as the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, and it's a good representation of the single biggest economic issue that's going to get France into trouble: the government going deeply into debt. A large part of that debt was centered on maintaining the palace at Versailles. It took 16 years to build. Nobody knows the exact cost because Louis XIV had all the records destroyed upon its completion. Nobles had to live at Versailles at least half of the year so that Louis could maintain their dependence on him and also be able to keep an eye on them. As a result, by the time of Louis XVI, the annual food budget of Versailles in current dollars amounted to around $4 million. Imagine what $4 million worth of groceries looks like, and that's basically what's being spent every year just to feed these people. In addition to supporting the nobles at Versailles, the government also had to support the royal family. This is Marie Antoinette. She's the wife of Louis XVI. They married when he was 15 and she was 14. Think about that for a moment. Marie was not French. She was born in Austria, which meant that she was part of the Habsburg family. The Habsburgs were the royals of Austria and longtime rivals of France. This should tell you that this marriage wasn't necessarily done for love. In fact, they didn't really meet until Marie came to France for the wedding. It's a political marriage, and because she's from the Habsburg family, she isn't necessarily going to be popular right off the top with the French people. This is exacerbated, there's a word for you, by the fact that she enjoyed looking pretty and looking stylish. Her annual personal clothing jewelry budget, if you want to translate it into current dollars, $1 million. Imagine getting $1 million and told that you could go to the mall and just have a good time. That's pretty much what Marie did every single year, and you'll see more of her excesses as we go through. Another economic problem that got France into debt was going to war. Starting with Louis XIV, France was very fond of jumping into big wars against their rivals, and these wars cost tremendous amounts of money. For 7 years, the French were fighting the British in what they referred to as the 7 Years' War. In American history, you learn of it as the French and Indian War. This didn't go well for Louis XV, and not only did it hurt the country economically, but it also hurt his standing with the French people that he couldn't pull through a victory. For Louis XVI, he pumped millions and millions of dollars into support of the American Revolution from 1776 to 1783. Ironically, this was going to put him in a situation where he was basically paying for his own people to go to school on how to take him down. Other economic problems. In order to preserve the mercantile system of Louis XIV, the old regime instituted import taxes called tariffs. The idea was to keep foreign goods out and encourage people to buy domestic goods. Unfortunately, what happens is, if you limit imports from other countries, they're going to limit what you can export to them, and therefore the tariffs had the negative effect of reducing French trade and slowing down its economy. Trade unions, guilds, formed during the Middle Ages to help protect their members and help keep prices and incomes up for craftsmen, kept prices up artificially. What happened is this created inflation within the economy. Add to that probably the worst thing that could have happened. In the 1780s, France ran into an incredible series of bad harvests. Weather conditions, drought, snow, all kinds of things prevented crops from growing properly, and as a result, food shortages, famines, and once again, skyrocketing costs of living. Getting to the point where a Swiss representative to France made this statement, one you might want to hang on to. In France, 9/10 of the people die of starvation, 1/10 of indigestion. Too many people dying from too little food, and too few people dying from too much food. Seems like there's an imbalance of things here. This is Jacques Necker, the finance minister for Louis XVI. Alone among his advisors, Necker had several ideas for economic reform. If the basic problem is spending more money than you have, there's a couple of easy solutions. 1, you stop spending so much. 2, you lower tariffs. While you're not collecting as much in tax money, at least in terms of rates, you are increasing trade, and therefore you might actually get more money if you prime the system a little bit. By far his most dramatic suggestion, though, was simply this: tax the nobles. 3% of the population controlling the largest single chunk of the wealth, and yet they're not contributing to the costs of government and the cost of living in France. Necker said, fix that. You'll see where this gets him. By 1789, the situation had gotten so drastic that Louis XVI called together the French equivalent of Parliament, the Estates General. Hadn't been called in over 125 years. The idea is that they're going to somehow deal with the economic crisis. Based on this cartoon, what do you think the Third Estate's looking for at the Estates General? If you'll notice, they're all on the same level. And perhaps that's what the Third Estate was hoping for. At least, as 97% of the people, they could achieve parity, equality, with the First and Second Estates. Unfortunately, that's not going to work out for a number of reasons. 1, each estate votes in a separate room. They never all meet together at one time, so there's no dialogue. They vote on issues as a separate group. Final decisions were made in the estate by making each estate getting one vote. Therefore, the Third Estate is always going to be outvoted 2-1. When the Third Estate discovers that they'll never be able to make reforms under this system, that's when they decide to make a change, and that's where we'll take it up again. See you soon.